My name is Daniela Labate Cavelli, and I am from NIAPRS. Welcome to this afternoon's webinar, Walking the Fine Line. And let's see if I can get these slides moving. Here we go. All right, so just a couple quick housekeeping things before we get started and turn things over to our awesome panel for today. Today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be found at niaprs.org within a couple of days. We're also offering 1 1/4 continuing education credits for today's presentation for social work, CPRP, and LMHC. CEs for New York State OMH and OASAS certified peers are pending, so we're hoping to be able to give you those as well. And in order to qualify for CEs, we just ask that you be in the virtual room with us and not called in on the telephone, so that you're in the app or on the computer. And that you complete the evaluation that you'll receive. You'll receive an email evaluation, and you'll get that within 24 hours of today's presentation. And as soon as you get that, you'll have about 48 hours to send it back to our office so that we can go ahead and process CEs. We also want this to be a, we have a presentation for you, but we also want you all to ask questions and be involved and comment and things like that. So we'll be keeping tabs of the chat box. Feel free to use the chat box and type in your questions or your comments to everyone so that we can all see it, or all panelists so that our panelists at least can see it. It's just so we make sure that everybody can take a look at what you're sending in. And I just want to take a moment now to introduce our very fine group of presenters. So we've got a great group for you today. So in alphabetical order, because I didn't want to do favorites because they're all my favorite. We have Stephanie Bullion, who is the Coordinator of Employment for Howie the Harp at Community Access. Liz Breyer, who is from the Coalition for Rehabilitation, the Center for Rehabilitation and Recovery at the Coalition for Behavioral Health, and she is the Senior Training and Implementation Specialist. Jonathan Edwards, Program Consultant at the Bureau of Alcohol and Drug Use Prevention, Care and Treatment for the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. Clinton Green, also from the Coalition for Behavioral Health at the Center for Rehab and Recovery, and he is also a Senior Training and Implementation Specialist. And Jeremy Ruling, who's the Director of On Track New York at MHA Westchester. And then we have Amanda Sake, who will be moderating our conversation today and facilitating our discussion. And she is the Special Assistant to the Commissioner at the Director and the Director of Office of Consumer Affairs at the New York State Office of Mental Health. So welcome to all of our presenters, and welcome to all of our folks listening in and watching today. We're not going to keep slides up. We want this to be conversational, but I did want to let everyone know that there is a slide that we're going to be posting on the website with all of the contact information for all of our presenters. So feel free to, you don't have to run to chat, to write things down right now, because we'll post it on the website, but be aware that we do have contact information for folks so that you'll have access to that as well. So I think I've covered everything. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Amanda to start us off.
Hi, thanks, Daniela. Lived experience of recovery from mental health conditions is prevalent among people working in a variety of roles throughout what we know as the behavioral health or mental health system. And regrettably, the presence of stigma and discrimination leads to an ongoing us versus them mentality, and creates a fear for practitioners who may be considering disclosing and or using their own histories as an advocacy tool to address structural inequities and barriers to system reform. So this webinar panel features individuals who identify in both professional or practitioner and peer capacities in a meaningful way. The panelists, Jeremy Ruling, Liz Breyer, Clinton Green, Jonathan Edwards, and Stephanie Bullion, will discuss the intersection for system-wide advocacy by practitioners with lived experience, and look at the potential impact of these strategies if more practitioners openly share and integrate their lived experience in their interactions with individuals served and colleagues. Some housekeeping, we're scheduled to go until 1:15, but we hope this sparks a continued dialogue beyond the presentation. And as Daniela said, you can always contact us by email. Daniela will be monitoring the chat box, and we'll have an opportunity for Q&A at the end of the presentation. We look forward to your participation. So we'll start off our discussion today with introductions, and the panelists will share what drew them to the conversation and why it's important with them. And I'll start with myself, Amanda Sake. You know, when I was first introduced to peer support, I was eager to be trained to use my lived experience in my work, and I was excited to participate in peer support. And when I began sharing my story in trainings, I saw the impacts of sharing my story with non-peer identified professionals. And we've been so fortunate to be doing this workshop for several years. And my absolute favorite part is when people come up to us after the training or after sharing, and they can relate to our stories and want to know more about how they can use their stories in their work. And there's a lot of potential for systems change with sharing lived experience. And the panelists are going to describe those benefits later. So I'll introduce each of the panelists who will briefly share what drew them to this conversation. And we'll start with Jeremy.
Okay, we'll start with me. Good, I guess it's afternoon. Good afternoon, everybody. Happy that you've all joined us today. So I'm Jeremy. I currently am working as director of a program called On Track New York at MHA of Westchester. We're one of a bunch of other On Track New York teams. And it's a program that provides both clinical treatment supports, but also a variety of other supports, including peer support, employment, educational support, family support to young people who are having early experiences with psychosis, hearing voices, feeling suspicious, having sort of, confusion around their thoughts. And I'm going to be in that role for a little bit longer, but I'm actually, my role is changing soon. We don't have to get into that. Why was I drawn to this conversation? I was drawn to it several years ago, really, speaking with Liz and speaking with Amanda about, the shared experience that we all have of, having these histories of, struggling and dealing with challenges related to our mental health. Mine really involve anxiety, depression, and have been, up and down throughout the years. I've been in and out of, different treatments at different times. But as a social worker, it's always been kind of a challenge for me to try to reconcile, this role of provider, especially when I feel so strongly connected to the peer community. And I guess I've just come to realize that it's a really important conversation, especially since I see so many benefits to people being able to openly share all parts of their identities. So that's why I'm here today.
Thanks, Jeremy. I'll pass that on over to Liz.
Thank you. Perfect timing for my ice machine to drop some ice. So I apologize if you hear that noise. I forgot to unplug it. Hi, my name is Liz. I've been doing this any second. I've been working in this field now over 20 years. I can't believe I've lived long enough to say that, but that is the case. And I think what drew me to this conversation started probably pretty early on in my career, which was having a significant trauma history and trying to figure out and parse out as I continue to work in different roles. And I've done a variety of things over the years, from administrative leadership to direct service, working in peer roles. Just what is really helpful. I experienced quite a bit of stigma from colleagues very early on, which is what kind of changed the course of my career, if I'm being honest, from looking at becoming a social worker to deciding that I didn't want to do that, because at the time, the majority of people who I was engaged in those conversations with that were, somewhat stigmatizing were social workers. And again, not hating on social workers, just that's how it played out 20 years ago. And it changed the course of my career, my direction, and how I continued to think about my own personal and professional development. So I think when I met Amanda and Jeremy, and I forget which one of you I met first years ago, because we've been friends a while now. But when I met both of you and I realized that we had the same experiences, it really motivated me to want to start saying this out loud. Up until that point, I was not really doing that. I was saying it in small circles here and there, but not as frequently and as often as I have now found that we've been able to do. And I'm really grateful for that experience. So that's what draws me. I'm really invested and interested in the systems change that our shared lived experience can bring so that we can actually create help instead of harming folks. So thanks.
Thanks, Liz. Clinton.
How did I know I was going to be next? Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm Clinton Green. I've worked in this field for almost 20 years now at this point, in variety of roles. What drew me to this conversation is a few things. One, that it's not talked about. As you said before, Amanda, like when it is talked about, we end up with quite a few people who are like, I have had similar experiences. The other thing that draws me to this conversation is that culturally, right, there are not a lot of space for people who look like me to have this conversation as well. So you're talking about stigma on multiple levels, like cultural stigma as well as professional stigma. And that when I first agreed to do this a couple of years ago, Jeremy and Liz were like, you know, when you're out, you're out. I was like, yes, I know. And I think it's important for me to step out on that limit, because if I can't, who's going to? So that's what drew me to this conversation, just my internal passion for it, as well as normalizing kind of, you know, people have stuff and go through things, and it's okay.
Thanks, Clinton. Next is Jonathan.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jonathan Edwards, and I am with the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene and the Bureau of Alcohol and Drug Use Prevention, Care, and Treatment. Good to see you all. What drew me to this conversation was, first of all, seeing Amanda, Liz, and Jeremy present this at the National Association of Social Workers New York City chapter conference several times, and just being attracted first and foremost by the title. For me, it really summarizes the story of my life. I feel like I'm always walking the fine line, even when I feel like I'm well adjusted. So it's an ongoing theme. It also resonates the message that I'm not alone. There are others like me. It doesn't mean we're the same, but it means that we can share similar experiences. And I also feel fairly well steeped in both the social work profession as well as peer support services. And I've been working in some degree in peer support services for almost 20 years, and in behavioral health probably for closer to 30. So I feel like it's an ongoing dialogue, and it's also an opportunity for us to help with messaging around dismantling stigma. I feel like there are so many opportunities for change and for transformation. One being just my reminding the person I report to that I was doing this today, not because I feel like I'm 5 and I need permission to do everything, but because I thought it was respectful and she should hear from me first that I'm participating in this really great dialogue. And she said, oh, would you like to share about this at a staff meeting, in the near future? And I'm like, what a great opportunity for me to advance what we're doing and to give it the context that it really deserves. So thank you so much, and I look forward to the dialogue.
Thanks, Jonathan. And last but not least, Stephanie. Oh, you're on mute.
Thanks. I got the prompt. Thank you, Amanda. So my name is Stephanie Bouillon. I've worked as coordinator of employment at Howie the Harp Advocacy Center for the past 3 years. which is a part of Community Access, where I've worked for the past almost 10 years now. I started my career as a peer specialist working at the First Crisis Respite Center in New York City. And then I worked with Clinton at Thrive at Work, a peer training program, which no longer exists. And now I find myself here. I recently completed my MSW in summer of 2020. And I think what drew me to this field, to this conversation, is that similarly to others, when I started my career as a peer specialist, I realized there was very much this us versus them kind of mentality still happening. And for me, it was kind of confusing because I had just come out of like years worth of training about how we are all people who experience, we experience like similar things, and these challenges are not, they're not supposed to be alienating, but they continue to be, right? So we're often contending with stigma, with alienation, and with a lot of different challenges that people are continuing to encounter, both from service providers and from other people within the field who are peers themselves, right? So I feel like we're still trying to do a lot of work. I know personally for me to think about like the impact that I'm having on others as I continue to provide services and as a supervisor. Yeah, so that's what drew me to the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie. So our first question, and this will be for Clinton, how do you use self-disclosure in your practice and in your work?
Sure. Thank you, Amanda. So I use self-disclosure very intentionally, and I just want to clarify what I'm talking about isn't necessarily disclosing to the people that you support, right? Because that's a different conversation and a different wheel. What I am talking about is how do you feel about disclosing to your colleagues? And if you feel comfortable, to your supervisor if necessary. And I think we're going to talk later about what sort of environment helps create the place where you feel safe doing that. So in this self-disclosure, I remember one of the places I worked, listening about, actually it was my first job in this field, how they talked about those people. And I was like, no, I'm one of those people. And now I can't tell you because I already know what you feel, how you feel about quote unquote those people. One of my later jobs, it became safer for me because again, just a different environment. And what I also recognize, and no one ever talked about it, ever, is that I wasn't alone in my experiences. So the consideration to disclose was one, what am I disclosing for, right? Is it just because I need to get some stuff off my chest? Like, who's it for? And yes. Two, is it relevant to what the other person is experiencing as well? And lastly, do I care? What I mean by that is, let's say the first two boxes are checked off, bang, bang, right? It's relevant. It's not for me, it's to support the other person. In this case would be a colleague. It's like, I see your anxiety is up. Let me tell you what happens with me when my anxiety is blah, blah, blah. The last question is, let's say they go down to the corner and yell it to the street. Do I care? And that is probably the most important question. Even if you check off the first two, again, because of stigma and being of what's related to it, just releasing that energy, like, I don't care. Even when I did this panel, I had a conversation with my family. It's like, by the way, just so y'all know, I'm going to be known as one of those people. Are y'all okay with that? Right? Not because of my own emotional energy, but because potentially of theirs. But those are the 3 questions I ask myself around self-disclosure, especially when I'm talking to a supervisor. I was fortunate enough to have a supervisor who, in this role, who understood, and at the same time, but those are the considerations I run through when considering disclosing to colleagues and supervisors. So thank you, Amanda, for giving me the time.
Oh, my pleasure. So this next question is for Stephanie, and congrats again on getting your MSW. And so, how has your view of peer values changed as your career has progressed?
Thanks, Amanda, for that question. I think my view of peer values, I won't say it's completely changed, but it's evolving, right? I have more tools, more engagement skills in supporting people in ways that are aligned with peer support values. And as my career has progressed, I think I've been able to encourage non-peer specialists to examine their own experiences as well as what it means to be a peer, right? And some of that has been through my own use of intentional disclosure, right? Over time, I think the recognition of stigma that surrounds lived experience has helped me in decreasing my own internalized stigma and helped me in becoming a better advocate for those that I work with, right? So I realized that many people who enter into helping professions, they're not peer identified, but they might have histories of trauma. A lot of people have histories of trauma. And that label isn't always necessary, to be honest, for them. And it's not always beneficial for them, right? Because of the stigma. Sometimes that results in lower salaries for folks. I know there are certain places that if you identify as a peer, you get paid, even if you have similar credentials to someone, you're getting paid less, right? And working in an employment setting, that's something to consider, right? We're devaluing people's experiences. We're telling them that their lived experience doesn't translate into more, even if they have significantly more experience than someone who's just coming into the field. So what really would be the incentive of sharing, right? And I guess through my career, and through my schoolwork, right, I've been able to share with classmates and colleagues that lived experience can actually help us in empathizing more with clients and operating from a place of mutuality and shared responsibility. And that can result in less othering and greater inclusion in decision making as well.
Thank you. I think that's a very important point to kind of breaking down those artificial walls that we have in our field. And when to Clinton's point and to your point, it does take away that space for that othering dynamic. So thank you. This next question is for Jonathan. Do you have an example of where you felt you needed to reconcile peer support values and traditional helping profession values espoused by clinicians?
Yes, certainly. Thank you so much. So I have a little note to myself here that, in order to answer the question, I wanted to make sure that I first understood it. And so just to rephrase, basically, I'm looking at have I ever been in a situation where I felt like I needed to walk the line and embrace the values of peer supporting clinical approaches simultaneously? And I have just a couple of examples. One is balancing advocacy and not going on the attack. And what I mean by that is taking the opportunity to try to move an agenda forward, an agenda that really needs to be in place without discrediting other individuals. I think challenging is different from discrediting. And I think a lot of that we do and needs to continue to be done in the system. So really around trying to build allies, but stand up for what we believe in terms of recovery-oriented practitioners. And also identifying and addressing internal and external stigma. So a lot of this came up for me in working with other people in the role of a supervisor, and sort of also being a licensed clinician, and peer specialist employees bringing issues to supervision, and my having to sort of balance those multiple hats that I'm wearing, to sort of help people to understand the importance of like interdisciplinary collaboration, but at the same time making sure that they're truly representing peer support values, that they can articulate them, that I can't determine whether or not they're going to believe in them, but how they represent them and how they employ them in their work. The other thing is recognizing the continual work of not harshly judging myself because of those multiple hats. And so being really transparent with people, which is not always easy, but just to make sure that, like, for example, people might say, well, are you really a peer? You have a social work license, or you have this, or you have that. And, for me, it's really important to say, hey, look, I'm not living my life by anyone else's design. I am a person with lived experience, both in mental health as well as substance use disorder treatment. And I also had professional aspirations, which were actually a big part of my recovery. So it's really important that I understand who I am and not feel like I have to convince other people that I have to play a particular role. And then lastly, engaging others in a teaching moment, following a stigmatizing experience. So working with people around understanding how the impact of their language and their actions and their beliefs and how they represent people in recovery, the impact that it can have on others when it's stigmatizing and it's ill-informed or under-informed. Once again, really trying hard not to alienate people, but to make allies of people and to really put a face on some of the things that we say about others and really how it impacts them. So I would say that that's really how I try to balance those moments and wear both of those hats simultaneously.
That's really powerful, Jonathan. I don't know if you saw how vigorously I was nodding my head in agreement to everything you were saying. That was wonderful. My next question is for Jeremy. If more people in provider or professional practitioner roles were to share their own lived experience at work, what changes would you expect to see in their immediate environments as well as within their larger communities?
So, I think this is like such an important question because, it's ultimately, I think we're all in this field, regardless of if we're in professional roles or peer roles or whatever, right? We're here to try to make a difference for people who are accessing the services that we work for. And, so much of that, I believe, is to help elevate the voice of people in services. But, the problem, and it's, it's been alluded to, I think Clinton really spoke to it before. When you have people who are accessing your services and yet there's sort of this othering that happens, right? Or this sort of, those people kind of attitude. And I've certainly seen that attitude too many times to count in different environments over the years. Then how are you really elevating those people's voices enough that you're actually providing the kinds of services that they want, the kinds of services that are going to be helpful and that they need, right? So I think that, that othering becomes such a huge barrier. And, what I've seen is when we can start, getting rid of that, that's when services start taking a different form. So there's a lot of ways to stop with the othering, right? It's something we can just be kind of conscious of on that straight up, like don't do that level. But, there's something very organic about a process when people, start, actually being able to look at themselves or their colleagues in kind of a different light, and to start seeing, the things that can connect us, the things that can bring us together. Before I worked for On Track, I worked at a community center. I was the director for a community center that MHA of Westchester has in White Plains. And I remember, like, when I joined as, a staff member, it was just in the beginning of this sort of transformation process that I was able to participate in, of really trying to, stop drawing those lines of, the staff is the staff and the participants are the participants. And what happened is I wasn't director when I was hired there. I was like director a couple of years later. So the director at the time, sort of stepped in, and she was a licensed mental health counselor, but she also immediately started disclosing her own lived experience to everyone, including the staff. And there was this thing that started happening, is that a lot of the staff members who were there, who had like not even like a little bit of lived experience, like really significant lived experience, but who were sort of not talking about it to each other, started sharing like just a little bit at a time. The people who were really uncomfortable with it, kind of decided maybe that, they were going to move on, not that they were pushed out the door. It was their own decision. And gradually it became this sort of open environment, not without boundaries, by the way. Like, boundaries are like super important, and I never want to downplay how important it is. Your job is still your job, right? Your role and your responsibility is still your role and your responsibility. Your supervisor is not your therapist. Like, all of that's really important things to remember. But when you start having that kind of environment, what happens is now we're seeing each other as people. And now we're seeing each other as people who might be able to connect to the experience of the people in our programs also. You start making decisions that are much more about inclusivity and bringing people into the conversation and asking people what they want, because you start seeing yourself or the people you work with in there. You start seeing other people's stories, where it's like, this isn't just like a person who I work next to, but they're a person with a story. If the person I work next to has a story, if I have a story, everyone else has a story too. It's someone, I saw it in the chat and I didn't read the whole thing, but, someone did ask this question, of course, of like, well, if everyone has a story, because everyone has a story, what about, sort of the fact that not everyone has, the same level of lived experience. I think that's part of what has to be discussed, right? I never, ever, ever would say, that I understand what it's like to go through a forced hospitalization, because I've never been through a forced hospitalization. That wasn't my experience. My experience had much more to do with isolation. It had much more to do with, sort of shutting down for an extended period of time. And my experience has to do with continuing to have moments where, I struggle to get through the day, the week, the month. It's not a forced hospitalization, right? It's not the same thing. And so it's so important for me to say, my experience is my experience, and this is what I can share about it. Your experience is your experience. I would love to learn more about that. There's probably pieces we can connect on where we do overlap. And let's focus on those commonalities. And there's probably pieces where, we just have to listen and learn from each other. Let's build that connection. So that's kind of what it's about to me. One of my favorite articles that probably a lot of you have heard of is called The Clinician's Illusion. It's like way back in the 1980s. It's super old. It's not like current research or anything like that. Not that anyone who's living in the 80s is super old, and I was alive in the 80s too. Liz, stop making that face at me. But more just, you know, as far as like body of research, right? It's been around for a while. We have to start understanding, like, we're surrounded by people with lived experience who have, you know, made strides in their life. And we should be expecting the same, the people we're providing services to also recover, also move forward, also have, you know, that same potential. I mean, the last thing I'm going to say, and then I'll stop, is just, you know, every time, you know, I'm like working in sort of my more clinical role, I hear so often from these young people and on track, like where one of them will say, oh, they have a career goal of wanting to be a therapist. You know, why is that? Because if you have someone who, you know, you have a positive relationship with, who sort of helps you, it might be something you aspire to do. And so when you think about it, of course, we're surrounded by colleagues who have these experiences, whether they acknowledge it or not. But we have to figure out how to lessen that fear of being othered by, you know, those who we work with.
Thanks, Jeremy. You know, and just something to add before I go to the next question, something that you really impressed upon me in conversations is that, you know, the more that clinicians come out and share the story, you know, it shifts attitudes of recovery, and, you know, recognizing the diversity of experience could lead to people, or at least lessen the likelihood of folks thinking in medical model diagnostic terms, if one reflects on their own recovery, the people that they serve. And so when it becomes real and tangible, it can be a real shift for culture change. This next question is for Liz. How can those in traditional clinical roles or practitioner roles use lived experience to help and foster systems change?
Thanks, Amanda. My favorite question. And it comes down to, I think, the culture that you're talking about. You know, we have a lot of power. Normally, we talk about that power. Well, first, I'm not a clinician, but I still maintain some level of power and have in the work that I've done. And normally we look at that power as, you know, the power over someone and trying to manage that in a one-to-one situation. But I've been more focused on the power that the system has over people, generally speaking, and the way that we can literally change the trajectory of someone's life based on the things that we have put into place as a system that, whether people are verbalizing that it's helpful or not, we still continue to do them. There's a real rigidity to the system that sort of parallels in a parallel process some of the rigidity that we often cite people receiving services possess. This difficulty in change, this difficulty in rethinking something, you know, kind of very black and white thinking around what we consider to be helpful. So I think back to very early on in my career and just the messages that I kept getting, and I continue to get, although now it is starting to look a little different. And I think it's largely due to folks like us who are willing to step forward and say, hey, we may be able to do this differently. Thinking about all of the things I was asked to participate in that re-traumatized me as someone who has a trauma history. And I've had multiple diagnoses over the years. Those for me are no longer the focus of where I'm at personally, but the trauma part. So what does that mean if you are someone who is in a professional role with that power and you're asked to put your hands on another person? What does that do for you as a person when we're asked continuously to overrule someone's will? You know, just the very definition of what the word compliant means is an overthrowing of someone's will to bend them to what we think is helpful versus what that person actually thinks is helpful. So as you can imagine, some of us with trauma histories, you know, we like to fight that. We don't necessarily roll with that. And that isn't everybody's experience either. Some people who have experienced trauma that's not the path that they choose to take. But I am definitely someone who, if I'm asked, do you want to fight? My answer is yes, I do. And let me tell you why. Let me tell you what is it about this that isn't working for me. So I think about that. I think about there's such strength in lived experience, and we have an opposite viewpoint of that. We look at lived experience as something that's a liability often. We look at it as a tarnish on someone's competency, rather than looking at all the different things that can influence someone's competency and how fluid that is. And just having a diagnosis is not the only thing that can impact someone's competency. And it doesn't mean that that's permanently impacted either. That's a very fluid thing. Rethinking how often we pathologize everything. Everything has to have a diagnosis and be viewed through this very deficit-based lens. We say that we're strengths-based, but then a lot of times the system puts us in a position as the people providing support that we're doing the opposite of that, that we're looking at what's wrong and how can we fix it. When we put people into forced situations, be it forced medication, be it forced hospitalization from a trauma perspective, and I think enough people are saying it at this point, it's not helpful. And yet we continue to do it. And we say it's for the well-being of others and for their safety. So it puts us in a bind where we're continuously not having options. There's very few ways that we can approach situations like that that aren't in some way doing harm to not just the person, but to us as well. So I look back at all the different things that I was asked to participate in that I did, not realizing, especially very early on, that there are other ways. And this is not helpful. This is not going to be benefiting anybody. And then seeing how my relationship with the person that I was supporting changed as a result of that dynamic, where trust was broken, where they no longer looked to me as someone who was on their side, where they didn't want to talk to me anymore. So I think about all of these things, and I think we have such great potential. So I know that my colleagues, will talk about the disclosure to people that you're working with. And I'm saying we have so much potential with disclosure for real system change. Again, I've been hearing that for so long. We've all been hearing that for so, oh, we need systems change. Well, real systems change can happen if the people providing the services recognize I would not settle for that. So why am I continuing to ask other people to do it? And I think that's the use of power in a good way. That is how we can really shift things, is by thinking about what would be helpful for us. And I can't tell you how many times, though, that we get so shaped by the work that we do also, where, Clinton and I have heard this, Amanda, you and I have heard this, Jeremy, in our trainings, where people will sit in the audience and say, yes, that is helpful. Calling the police on someone in emotional distress, that's helpful. Putting someone in restraints when they're looking to harm themselves, that's helpful. Like, people will repeatedly fall back on that. And so I'm encouraged by the possibility that we can do something different. The older I get and the more that I see all of the intersectionality of health issues that I've experienced because of trauma, because of mental health diagnoses, because of being asked to participate in these things, I realize that there is no one way that helps. And people should be able to define what's helpful for themselves. And then we should be 100% willing to support folks around that. Not as an add-on, not as an, oh, but you need to do this first. You need to take your meds and go to groups first before I'm going to even think about supporting you and getting a job or living independently or whatever it is that the person sees as a goal. And the same on the peer side. So I openly identify. I've gotten lots of pushback from people, more so folks who are on the advocacy side or activist side. And my comment is, of course, you don't need education to do this work. But that was a huge part of my recovery, and downplaying it for those of us who have actually worked really hard to get that can also be just as harmful. Does it give me a level of advantage? Yes, because in this current system that we have, it's still very much being driven by those degrees that you have behind that piece of paper. But that does not undermine the value of the lived experience that you have. It shouldn't undermine the lived experience that I have and how much it meant to me for healing from trauma to work for 12 years to get an undergraduate degree, one credit at a time. And then to go on and get a master's degree, that was huge for me. So many people in my life told me, you won't be able to do that. That was huge. So just things to think about. Okay.
That's so powerful, Liz. So we're getting some really great questions and comments in the chat box. So we'll do our last question in a go round, and then we'll transition to the questions in the chat box. So our final question is, what are we hoping can be different as a result of this conversation? And I'll go first. Again, I think that systems change I think for all of us is really important. Breaking down those walls of that us versus them, and like everyone said earlier, like if we can see ourselves more, see our colleagues more in some of the situations where the individuals we serve are in, I think that there's that can only improve our work and improve our approach to care. So I really, from a systems change perspective, I think that sharing lived experience, again, was very, very powerful. And I'll just go through the order I did before. Jeremy, would you like to go next? And then Liz?
I mean, I don't want to sound like I'm just repeating what Amanda just said. But I really think, and Liz before her, and pretty much everyone before, I think systems change is the thing, right? It's really, the question I think we have to, ask ourselves is, one, if we've actually been through the system, how was that experience for us? And if we haven't, but have worked in it, would we want to go through that system for ourselves? I was so lucky in a lot of ways that I was able to avoid going into the public mental health system and had, sort of my own, natural and peer supports around me during the toughest times that I faced. And also some people who sort of knew like this was the system, like sort of saying like, I don't know if going there is the place you want to go. Now that sounds a little bit like a pretty harsh indictment on our system, and here I am working in it, but there's just elements of it that, continue to be really problematic. And those, those elements, I mean, one of the things that, we talk a lot about in the peer community and in certain aspects of the social work community, right, are voice and choice. There's not enough of that right now in our system, and people need to be able to have a system that works for them. So I do think, the more that we're sort of able to humanize things and to not, sort of have this idea of providers who are sort of above, the fray, I think that's what helps move our system forward.
Thanks, Jeremy. We'll do Liz and then Clinton.
Sure. What I'd love to see, and I think we are starting to see it slowly, is definitely rethinking fragility, rethinking the way we think about people and the experiences that they're having, and stop putting people in these places of being too fragile. Because I know that view was put on me for a very long time, and it can be very harmful. I'd also like to see a shift from, and I've tried to start to change my language even on how I'm framing this, from the people that I support to the people that I collaborate with, so that we can start to see folks, move away from some of the passive roles they find themselves in after, sometimes years, but it doesn't even take years of being told, this is what is good, this is what would be helpful, this is what you need to do in order to do X. So more of a collaborative role, and I guess more of a focus on lived experience as being a strength. Like this makes us strong. This doesn't make us weak. Do we have moments when we may not be feeling so great? Yes. Do we have moments when we're not thriving? Yes. Do we have maybe more than moments when we're not thriving? Yes, but we're still strong. And I think every person who brings what they bring to the table makes us strong. And then lastly, and this is not my phrase, but I do repeat it because it impacted me so much, is let's make room at the table for peers. If for those who want it to be a profession, for those who want to have a discipline, for those who are looking to move this forward, let's make room at the table for them. That, I think, is a critical piece of it. Recognizing not everybody wants that, and that's fine too, but let's make room at the table.
Before I go to Clinton, I just wanted to piggyback off of Liz said. You know, so much of my recovery is connected into my work. You know, and it's been such a difficult week for me emotionally, and this webinar, I was so looking forward to it because this discussion is so key, and this has helped, and by so, you know, we get a lot of, you know, everyone gets a good feeling when they're, you know, collaborating with and supporting others, and so when we think about, you know, the folks that we work with, helping to elevate them to a place where they can support people is really important. Okay, we'll do Clinton and then Jonathan.
Sure, thanks, Amanda. So Liz actually stole one of my points. Language.
I'm sorry.
Okay.
We work together too much. That's
The language that we use can be so powerful. So if we're talking about systems change, right? How we describe people, how we describe ourselves. There were a couple of questions about quote unquote professionals or calling ourselves clinicians. That has an impact on how we interact with others, or how we see others. So part of the system change is looking at the language we use and potentially not weaponizing it. The schizophrenic, I think Jonathan mentioned, Jeremy mentioned earlier, the peer supporter, right? Which puts you in a box. You know, the language we use around the people that we support, rather than it just being a person that I'm here to support, right? A person who has needs. The other point I wanted to address is something Jeremy also said, is how do we create an environment where folks, employees, and I'm not sure if I like that word, speaking of language, but people who are working feel comfortable, and how do you create an environment where folks are comfortable in saying, you know what, I'm having a bad day, and you know, my anxiety is on 8 right now, and today's not going to be great for me. Or, you know, I got to my door and my body told me, you should go back inside. And I went back inside, so I'm taking today off, right? How do you create an environment where folks feel that that's okay? Or even in this current environment where a lot of it is virtual, there are some days, actually yesterday is one of those days, I was like, I'm not feeling it. And I'll do it, and I'll do it the best I can, but wasn't having my best day. So what are the things that we need? And it's something we need to think about culture-wise in our agencies. What are the things we need in order to create that warm and welcoming environment?
So beautifully put. Jonathan and then Stephanie.
Just making sure I'm off mute first. Okay. Thank you for the thumbs up. So I'm listening to everyone and I appreciate the comments. Going back to what can be different, for me, it's always about perception. And my experience in communicating with my colleagues there's always this subtext, or often the subtext of like, you got to be either or. And, like this word that we use so often, integrating, integration, implementation, I just think that we need to remember that we're people first and that we're not binary. Our experiences are not bifurcated. I look at myself and, like if success had to do with fitting into a box, I would be a failure. And I think, what could be different is that we realize the universe of possibilities like that we've done for ourselves, that we have the privilege of playing a role in helping others to realize. So both on an individual level and in the system. And I just think that it goes back to perceptions of what's possible. And I think I know a couple of times people talked about boxes and fitting into boxes and things being very linear. And I think that's the problem, is that we're always trying to define and we're always trying to put labels on things. And that's not at all expansive. So I really think what could be different is our perceptions, perceptions of people who work in the system, our perceptions of ourselves, like on a day when we don't feel well, like today, for me, is to really do that work of not pathologizing it. And it's so very difficult, especially once the wheels get spinning. And the more we pathologize our own sort of, ailments, we find ourselves back at square one. So I think it's really important. And one example I'll give very quickly is I would have folks come to me, and I don't want to use that word. I have people coming to me in supervision saying that they didn't feel well. And there was always that temptation to go back to saying, I don't know if I'm getting sick again. And it was important not to discount how they were feeling or what they were bringing, but to just, kind of explore like what might be going on without being their therapist. And oftentimes it's like, oh, I haven't been sleeping well, or I'm not eating well, or I'm not doing this, or, I've been back to work for 3 months and I'm not used to working 8 hours. And it's important to explore all that so that people don't begin to feel like when they're experiencing things that we all experience, that it's not that I'm getting sick again, that there's something wrong with me because I don't feel well today. And for me right now, I'm doing the very hard work of telling myself there's nothing wrong with me, even though I'm not feeling well. I'm not convinced, but I'm here, and I'm grateful, and thank you.
So thanks, Jonathan. And Stephanie.
Thank you. Thank you, Jonathan, also for sharing that. Because I guess I'm going to stay away from systems change right now and talk about more like on a micro level, right? I think being honest with ourselves and thinking about how we're showing up for folks we're collaborating with, I think that's really important. And as people have previously said, paying attention to the language that we're using, constantly reevaluating ourselves. And like, yeah, like I was reading some of the comments, and peers are professionals. We are professionals. We're professionals in our own right. And I agree also with what Liz and Amanda and Jonathan said. A part of my own recovery was thinking about how to work towards my own goals in a way that was meaningful for me. And similarly to Jonathan, like think about like not being hard on myself when things are not going perfectly. Because I think sometimes I know for me, and this conversation really highlights that, thinking about there's something wrong, right? Because I'm not feeling perfect, and kind of like shifting away from those kinds of thoughts, because everyone has bad days, right? Yeah, that's all I have to say. Thanks.
Thanks, Stephanie. Danielle, is it okay if I turn it over to you to share questions?
I was saying yes, absolutely, but I was muted. So yes, absolutely. We've got several questions that have come in throughout the presentation. You guys have been awesome at sort of catching things in the chat box and addressing them. So I'm going to try to sort of gear the conversation towards things that we haven't yet talked about. And then if we have time, we can go back to touch on some of the other questions, if that's all right with you all. So the first question, in no particular order, of course, is someone asked if the panelists could address career ladders and the prospects of advancement in the mental health system in jobs that are not yet open to disclosed peers.
I'm going to jump right in on that one because it's something that's, I think, really, really, really important. So, first of all, yes, it's really needed that there's career leaders. And the really challenging thing is that there's so far not enough of them. This is something that actually, especially with Liz, I've been involved in a lot of conversations about. I think part of it is, that people have to find their paths. So, one version of a career ladder, for example, would be that a peer specialist might decide to go back to school and get a different kind of degree and move forward in that way. But, that's not for everyone. And as was stated before, peer specialists are professionals in their own right. I think, creating more supervisory roles for peer specialists is important. I think finding ways to maybe challenge some of the licensure kinds of requirements around who can provide what kinds of services might be worth looking at a little bit, to say, why is a certain group of people being excluded from this? Ultimately, like if someone's providing a certain kind of service, it shouldn't be based on what kinds of experiences they've had. It should be based on, have they developed the skills and expertise needed for whatever that service might be. So, I think that's really important. But I do think, agencies that are really talking about having recovery-oriented services, who are, trying to create room for more peer services and so on, it is really important that they're, walking the walk, and not just saying those things, but actually trying to intentionally and actively pull people with lived experience into leadership positions, creating job roles that are not entry level for people who identify as peers and that don't necessarily require someone to also have a social work degree, or don't necessarily require someone to also have some sort of other advanced degree, but rather, maybe basing it more off of years of work experience as a peer provider. So those are some of the ideas. I think, at government level, hi, Amanda, it's really important that, we look and see, are there policy level initiatives that are going to help to create new opportunities, funding opportunities that are going to create new opportunities for peer specialists as well. If any peer specialists, though, are interested in going that sort of, older traditional education route, I am going to throw in a plug just because I know that Ethan, who's running this program, is in the audience today. There is a social work program that's starting at Utica College that is going to really be actively targeting people with lived experience as recruits if they are interested in that profession. So that's, maybe another route for people as well.
Great, thank you, Jeremy. Anybody else want to chime in on that one, or should we move on?
We can move on. You did a good job. He covered it.
Okay, no worries. All right. There's another question in the chat about supports. So wondering if there are any support groups for peer professionals that you that our panelists could share with the group. I know there was one attendee that posted in the chat box, and I forwarded that to everyone for them to see, but just wondering if there was anything else that you guys wanted to share about that.
I'm not aware of anything official. I don't know if any of you are. Just we've thought about doing that ourselves, actually. And then for a variety of reasons, it hasn't moved forward. We were looking at what's the best way to do that. This, of course, was pre-pandemic. So when people were still able to do things more in person. But we haven't really landed on a way that we felt completely comfortable with, I guess, is a way to say that. Does that sound right? Yeah. So I don't know. I saw Michael put something though in the chat. So apparently there is something, right?
Yeah.
And I just want to chime in and say that I think in efforts to create spaces, we want to make sure that we're not going to replicate excluding people, replicating like the harm and trauma of excluding people from opportunities. And I think that's, I've had numerous conversations about, oh, let's, think about creating this space, but then it's like, well, who do we invite? And as soon as that pops up, it, just becomes a different animal versus like opening it up to anyone who self-selects. But then if you have a particular focus, then that could also be a challenge. So it's kind of hard to find that middle ground.
All right, I'm going to move us to the next question. And there was a couple of questions around this, and there were a few comments in the chat box, and people shared some differing opinions on it. So curious to hear what our panelists have to say, but asking for about some more information regarding navigating boundaries when sharing lived experience and encouraging that in the workplace.
Ooh, could I jump in on that one? Sorry, Clinton, go ahead. You can. Yes.
Sure. So navigating boundaries in the workplace. I think that's important. It's especially, I'm going to speak from this from my years of supervisory roles, in that providing support and still doing all the administrative stuff, and helping folks develop their skills, and at the same time investing in them as an individual without being their therapist. So I can ask, like, Amanda, you look down today, right? How are you doing? How can we support you? Again, it goes back to that kind of welcoming and warm environment. Do you need to tell me all of your business? No, you don't need to. But how can I support you today? And that is part of that boundary. I can care about you as a person and support you as a person. And I count all of my panelists as my friends. And we still have boundaries. There's some things we're just like, no, we're not going to do. We don't do that here. And I think, especially if the environment that you're working in isn't welcoming, knowing where those boundaries are is important, even if you have to set them up yourself. So Liz, you have a different perspective, maybe?
No, not a different perspective. I agree with everything you said, but I also would put on the table for us to consider when I normally see that question come up, and it's almost always referring to peer specialists and how they don't respect boundaries and they're always putting all their stuff out there. And I just got to say, every time I've seen what I would call a boundary violation, it's come from the clinician, including violating HIPAA, including putting people's business out there in hallways, including when you start to potentially share something in a training, and the minute you say lived experience or trauma history, and everybody does this, waiting to hear what it is about yourself that you're going to disclose. So I would put on the table that, yes, boundaries are important. Think about who's uncomfortable in that situation, though. Are we uncomfortable because what they're saying is making us feel something? Or is it really a boundary violation where perhaps they've shared too much and it's re-traumatizing someone else? Because there is a difference between that.
I'm going to just throw in my 2 cents really fast also, which I'm a big believer in leading by example with this kind of stuff. So especially if you're in a supervisory position or otherwise have any kind of power in your role or position, you can model things, right? You can say, you can share things, and you can hold things back in a way that, shows it's okay to share things, but it's also okay to, not share everything. I've been able to have some supervisors who have done that very skillfully, who share things you know, when it's relevant, when it's something that, you know, moves the conversation forward, when it helps to make a point about, you know, why their lived experience has that value, but at the same time have not only stated explicitly like it's important to have boundaries, but have also shown boundaries by, you know, saying at times, you know, they don't want to get into something, or this is private, or, you know, sort of, you know, I always want anyone who's in a peer role, you know, and I always try to do this myself, is I don't have to share something if I don't want to. You know, disclosing that you have lived experience doesn't mean that your life is an open book for everyone. It means that you're disclosing something by choice, and you will continue to have choices to disclose at the times that you want to.
Well said.
Jonathan, did you want to jump in? I saw you had your hand raised, but I think that might have been like an extra click accident thing.
No, I actually did raise it, but
Okay.
I'll try to respond to something else.
Okay, we have 3 minutes left, and I want to be respectful of everyone's time, but I did just get one last question in the chat box that sort of piggybacks on boundaries. So this person wanted to know about an example of something that you're quote unquote not going to do in terms of boundaries. They have employees who have disclosed that they have some lived experience, and sometimes as the supervisor, this person isn't really sure of what to do with that information. So is it around helping the person with their boundaries when they work with other individuals, or taking, and then this person also, sometimes they take it as information for them to know so that they can accommodate the staff person as best as they can. Not really sure what to do with it, or what he or she quote unquote should be doing. And can you all offer some insight on that?
I'm gonna throw that to Stephanie.
Sure. Yeah, I was actually just thinking about that. So I think for me, something that me and my supervisor talk about is the integration of peer values into my supervisory style. So I would even maybe in a very tactful and kind way, ask why that information is being shared, and if there's some sort of support that the employee actually needs around it, right? I feel that kind of operating from a non-hierarchical perspective in this particular situation makes sense, right? Because sometimes in my experience, people are sharing because it's kind of what a lot of peers are taught to do, right? That was my experience. I was taught to use intentional disclosure as necessary to share parts of my experience. But similar to what Jeremy was saying, there have been times where I've had supervisors who kind of like almost pushed me in this direction that felt very unsafe and uncomfortable to kind of like share, almost for like, I'm not really sure why, to be honest, because it wasn't intentional or for any particular purpose related to my employment. So it's like, I think we have to be honest, I guess, with ourselves and think about why we're sharing, but also if someone is sharing, I think it's okay to ask why, and if they need some sort of additional support around that. And I actually want to throw that back to Clinton, because I'm curious about your thoughts around that.
It's interesting because Stephanie and I worked together. What during our time together, and I want to thank Stephanie for being as great as she was in helping educate me around peer values and what that was, and as well as helping me to navigate kind of supervising individuals with lived experience, right? So did I ask about, you know, what your diagnosis is, you know, what are you experiencing right now? Not necessarily. Again, not getting to the therapist role. What I did ask about was, how can I help you? I noticed, again, your energy level is off today. Or I noticed in these particular situations, this happens. How can I help you around that? If you want to tell me more, that's great. If you know, there's, again, we're all human. So if there's something external that's affecting this internal, help me understand how I can help you. And that was my approach. Was I always successful? No. But that was my goal, because I wasn't. There were some times I wasn't having I was having a bad day and could not have that discussion further up the ladder. So I don't know if anyone else, again, trying to be respectful of folks' time, Daniela.
And we are a couple minutes over time, so thank you for that, Clinton. Any last words from anyone on the panel or presenting today?
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for
Yeah,
listening.
thank you. And let's keep the conversation going.
Yeah, we could have this conversation, I feel like, for like 6 hours if we wanted to. So
Seriously, and questions keep coming into the chat box, so we totally
Yeah.
could have. And I just want to say thank you to all of you. I know you all are friends of NIAPers, and it's always a pleasure working with all of you. And we're so grateful that you
Same.
took the time to be with us this afternoon, especially on a Friday afternoon. And it's actually quite nice out in some parts of the state. So,
Thanks,
thank you for
Daniela.
that. Always a pleasure. And thank you to all of our attendees for hanging in there with us today on a Friday afternoon. We appreciate you as well. And we hope to see you all again soon. Have a great day, everyone. Thanks so much.
thank you.